Welcome to another episode of Insights with Ovationz, where we like to showcase the talent and subject matter experts on our platform that you can easily book to bring in for a one-on-one engagement, as well as to bring into your organizations and your businesses. My name is Aaron Ellis. I am your host. And again, around the insights, I like to get everybody understanding the personal and the professional of the people that we work with. I think that's a very important facet. So Jahmaal, I'm going to be asking you some questions around that. Hope you're okay with that. But first, I want to say welcome.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, so a little bit about Jahmaal. From what I learned, I'm meeting him for the first time face-to-face, but I did learn that he's a counselor, a consultant, a public speaker, and he focuses on spreading awareness of and resolving issues of perfectionism, fear, procrastination, and addiction. Love that. Can't wait to dive into that. Also, his work with teams and managers and organizations and businesses. He's able to identify how people are merely existing instead of living, surviving instead of thriving, and really help them understand the source of their problematic patterns and lead them to an experience of true transformation. Honestly, Jahmaal, I hope I did you justice in what I took from you, but that's what I saw today when I was looking. Where I want to start is what led you to what you're doing today. I mean, the beauty of it is, I think, and from what I've learned, is you're literally living what you did for yourself, right? And I think that's huge when it comes to the integrity and your effectiveness. So if we could start there on what brought you to what you're doing today, that'd be great.
That's a great question, Aaron. And what brought me to where I am today is anything that I would not have planned. The way my story is, I wouldn't have written it that way. So I came from a very abusive childhood. One parent who was absolutely divine, my mother, and one who, before his life changed, was mean enough to be Satan himself, which was my dad. He was an alcoholic and also a drug addict. So my first $1,000 that I had saved up in my bank was actually smoked up by him. When he was high or drunk, he was very unpredictable, and he would also be very hard to read. He could be very physically and verbally abusive. And so as a young man, I thought that every other dude had some X factor that I didn't have. And so I lived to, since home was so out of control, my desire was to control everything I could. So that was controlling the environment outside of home, controlling my professional environments. And so I got nothing less than an excellent or outstanding on every performance appraisal. I was always a person where somebody approached my mom like, "Oh, you do such a great job with your son." I made sure that no one had anything but praise for me. Wow. But you take that into a professional purview. I was the first to get to work, last to leave. I was always told by supervisors and managers, like, "Man, you're so dependable and you always answer your phone." So on the outset, that sounds like a compliment. But if you think about it, that represents a person with horrible boundaries. And so my quote unquote, we see so much today, and I'm sure as a speaker, you see the word high performance. There's nothing wrong with high performance. I was a high performer, but it was just a performance. It was a trauma response rooted in a fear of rejection. What I could control, I did control. And I never troubled the waters, never picked up any dust, never said no. and on the surface, that looks like, oh man, that's the one I want on my team. But I was full of resentment. And so working through, the outset of, my own addictions and my own ways of coping, and part of my coping mechanism was to overwork, was to overextend, was to always be the voice of reason, was to be the social parameter for the community, the friend group, was to even being involved in faith-based spaces, be the person in 7 different ministries, always looked at as like, oh, he's the model person. But inside I was raging because I had so much, I was on the run, and a lot of what we see in what is called excellence and high performance is just someone on the run from themselves. Because if I pause and sat still long enough, I still had to deal with me. And it got to the point around 2009 where I could not run from me anymore. I could no longer outrun me. And even though I, gotten my major and my bachelor in counseling and psychology, I needed help. And so I chose to invest, thousands of dollars in months, 13 months into my own mental and spiritual and physical wellness, and literally seek out some help and find out what are the root causes of why I'm showing up this way in life. Because this doesn't just happen by happenstance. You don't just show up on autopilot without there being a purpose and a story behind it. So that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, to save people all the time, money, and years that I wasted living my life as a defense mechanism. You're looking at someone who existed.
Yeah, that it's really interesting because one of the things that I really talk around is about awareness. And I know you've said that I read this somewhere from you too, at least in a different way, but like you can't change what you're not aware of. And bringing in that awareness really is, honestly, it's the first step, but it also can be something that deters people and scares people off. Like, how did you work through that on your own? Like when you started to really see yourself, like, oh crap, right? How did you work through that? How did you, and how do you take that forward and help others who come up to that, that reflection in the mirror when they start to become aware of like, oh my gosh, which turns into, honestly, from my experience, they have to come to a place of personal responsibility around it, right? How did you work through that yourself, and how do you work with that with others?
Well, I say it took a long time. At first, we see so much in the industry, especially the industries that you and I work in, about EQ. But
Yeah.
the thing I see that's missing, I was already very pretty sensitive, especially as a guy, an empath. I was aware of how others were feeling. That was the problem. I was always concerned about how others were feeling, and I never stopped to pause and say, Jahmaal, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about taking on said responsibility that is not yours? How do you feel about the fact that you are controlled by the reactions of others, and that you go through life projecting what you think people are feeling about you, only to turn into a chameleon and match pace? And so I had to actually get to that place of wondering, why, as a professional, I'm even leaving money on the table when I negotiate. Because if I'm in a meeting and somebody's face kind of contorts, oh, wait a minute, I've asked for too much. It's just like, you're working harder than most of the other staff. You should be asking for that much. You're worth that. And I literally had to go away. So I literally went, even impatient. And for me, that's what I had to do, and so I had to actually just kind of get out. I was of Washington, D.C., get silent, get into a place where I was away from everything I was familiar with. And that really helped me to face myself down. It was a little different like now, where you can kind of come offline and live your life offline. Back then, I'd come to such a breaking point that I was actually willing to really get quiet enough, turn off the phone, turn off life for a little bit. But then even that stuff was still there. I was seeing it resurface, that desire to be everything to everyone. And so I actually had to start taking some risk. And the work I do with clients is actually, one, isolating the root causes of the patterns, and then going in and slowly disrupting them, because you have to slowly do it. Because I think a lot of times you see in the mental health space a shaming for people's coping mechanisms. The brain only knows what it knows.
Yeah.
We do things because that's what we've been taught and what our brains have been coded to do. And so with a client, actually, we deal with childhood you, who has the rose-colored glasses on. We deal with teenage you, who actually begins to rebel and question some things. And then we deal with adult you that's looking back like, whoa, why did I waste that time? When the resentment is set in. So dealing with a client in 3 different stages, because those are the 3 different stages where I had to go and deal with and heal some serious core wounds. And I think those are the things, the qualitative things that we ignore, that will still follow us if we don't deal with them. So a big part of my healing process was actually dealing with, okay, how do I still honor my mother? How do I still honor my father and still face myself down for this is what happened, but then also take responsibility for how am I then processing this intel and how do we execute? And it takes a lot of training. It takes a lot of focus. It takes intentionality, and it takes being committed to the process.
Yeah. So let's dive in this a little bit deeper, because I'm seeing the thread running through what you're saying and some of the things that I read and my thoughts around it. So we talk about some of these problems that we cited in the beginning, like perfectionism and fear and procrastination, right? And addiction. I know we could go run the gamut and down that rabbit hole, and not just like the traditional things people call addiction, but there's other addictions, right? So
goodness, yes.
How are you going into the world as it is, the paradigms as they have been, and shifting that narrative? And let me explain a little bit further. So you go into an organization where typically people, their brain knows what it knows. They've been programmed to a degree where their subconscious says, I need to be afraid, always on guard. I need to play not to lose rather than play to win, right? Which leads them to procrastinate, which leads them to this mental illness of perfectionism, right? How are you bridging that gap and actually bringing self-awareness into the professional space, where I'll go a little bit further, but I'll stop there because I know you're going to have a good answer on this.
I love that question. It's actually going in to retrain the brain and going in and first exposing what needs to be unlearned. And it's easy to do it in a place where leadership wants a culture change, because a cultural shift really should happen on home front. It's harder to bring it from the outside in, but when you bring it from the outside in with someone who is actually hungry for it, that makes it a lot easier. And so the main thing is working with middle managers and CEOs, because if you think about it, they get held from up top, from the board, their manager, and also potentially from their direct reports. And with managers, it's actually teaching them, let's take the NT off management. Manage me. So what are the ways I psychologically, spiritually, mentally, physically manage myself? And understanding, there's going to, even for those who are upper level managers, most of them didn't want to be managers. Most of them wanted to be what? A subject matter expert. Just give me my corner office, corner cubicle, leave me alone. But it's like, the path to promotion is actually you have to manage direct reports. So it's like, how do I then manage a team of 10 to 20, sometimes to 50? And I've not even yet learned to manage myself. People think leadership is pushing paper. Leadership actually is managing people, but you have to understand your own psychology and actually bringing that person to those places that we rather avoid. Sometimes we think, ladies, if I put on a pair of heels, or guys, if I put on a pair of loafers, somehow I walk through this door a changed person. No, you bring yourself, you bring your family history, you bring your belief system, you bring your psychology, you bring any addictions or any habits that you may have, you still bring that through the door with you. So dealing with people at all of those layers, and then dealing with the fear and communication that happens between teams and managers in the direct reports. Like, how do we broach that? Presenting numbers first. If you go into an organization, it's like, listen, on the low end, this is costing you 12 to 24K every time someone resigns and you bring on a new employee. These are the numbers. So this is your bottom line walking out the door, and especially now in this economy, you want to be saving some revenue. You want people who are mission minded, not just outwardly, but inwardly. So there has to be a culture shift, but it has to happen by the individual. And when you can get an individual at one time who has enough influence, then it begins to affect the collective. And so that's the work I go in to do, to actually, let's isolate the root cause of why we're showing up the way we're showing up. And let's actually expose those fears and that deep fear of rejection of like, man, this is my bread and butter. How do I actually navigate this space in a way that puts me in a winning position? I think if you think about me, I'm from a psychological background. Most of us function on what? CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of merit for that. But we don't often focus on the belief that shifts the behavior. It's another little phrase I'll coin. The belief that shifts behavior. Once we work on what you believe, how you behave will follow right behind.
Man, you're speaking my language, honestly. I walk people through how, they think if they just change what they're doing, the action, then things will change. But no, their beliefs actually drive the feelings, that drive the thoughts, that drive the actions. So you got to go to that route. So I love this. I love you brought up something else I was going to bring up, and I just want to highlight it. We don't even necessarily need to talk about it. And I'll explain it in the context of this. Over the last 10 years, I've seen organizations be more receptive of this kind of work. And I've also been able to quantify it on a bottom line level, on a revenue level, on a, saving them money, which a lot of them, to get them to open up to it, you had to connect that dot for them. So I love that you brought that up, because it's something that's become easier and easier to do, honestly, over the last handful of years. Even since COVID, I saw it accelerate from the bridging the gap of people coming back to the workplace and stuff. So I love that you brought that up. Now, you mentioned something earlier about, I don't remember how you said it, but taking small steps. And I want to talk about that in the sense to one of the products that we're doing in Ovationz that we're actually getting a lot of traction with. And that's these short form talks, or these micro talks that we're doing, right? They're less content. They're more driven towards action, right? And we're following them up with a Q&A. So whatever is spoken about, like somebody like yourself can come in as a subject matter expert and then can answer questions to actually further integrate and make it unique to that organization. I know a couple things that I saw that we have around what you're doing is like healthy boundaries as a professional, or boundaries in the workplace. So we've talked a lot about boundaries, and you mentioned it being at home and stuff first, and a lot of those shifts needing to happen at home. But what are you doing when it comes to helping people set boundaries in the workplace? And what does that actually mean in context of everything we've been talking about?
I love that. One thing we're doing is actually establishing on an individual level, first, the boundaries are for you. And I think it's then been this consensus that boundaries are for other people. Like, oh, I just established boundaries, and people just somehow clairvoyantly know. No, they're for you first. When you honor your boundaries, guess what? Other people will. And so actually training and retraining the brain how to honor your own boundaries. And when you honor your own boundaries, even professionally, it's funny how management will understand like this is a valuable proposition. You know, one thing I do, and I do some mentoring through another app called Tiger Hall, is actually presenting what you call the receipts. We know in the infamous Diane Sawyer interview with Whitney Houston, she said, what? Show me the receipts. That's where that word came from.
Yeah.
And your receipts are your KPIs. And so when you present that before your management, you say, this is why you guys onboarded me. This is what I'm here to do. I'm actually overloaded at this point with projects that have been punted to me through so many different divisions. I cannot then do what you've onboarded me to do. And so as a project, from a project management standpoint, I am over scope and I cannot fulfill the mission. Always reaffirm that you are mission minded. That's going to be what power positions you. And that's also going to show that you're honoring your boundaries and you're actually honoring what the company mission is. That's what speaks to CEOs. You got to speak their language. So you're over delivering on your projects and under delivering on drama.
Wow. I love that you use the word honor. I usually shift that word in people because I call the word respect a non-word, because most people only talk about respect when they're feeling disrespected. And same with the word fair. Most people only talk about fair when they feel something's unfair. Like you never sit around a coffee shop and hear like, you know, Jahmaal, I was respected so much today. Listen to this. Or Jahmaal, I was treated so fairly. You never hear that. You hear the opposite. So I love that word honor, that you use that word honor. And just the thing to touch on those on boundaries, because I really think it's important to drive home what you just said. And I recommend with every one of these podcasts, they're 20 minutes long. Go back and listen to this again, everybody, because this is extremely important. But setting boundaries is about you. And it's about, and holding a boundary is about you. So many times I'm sure you hear like, oh, well, I set the boundary. I told them, well, did you reassert it? Did you keep it established? You're just as responsible for holding the boundary as they are for honoring it. Technically, you have to honor it before they're going to honor it. So I think that is awesome that you've brought that up. Like you're speaking my language. This is really exciting. I think it's very, very cool how you've been able to bridge the gaps on how you're doing this in business too. And you're bringing up things like KPIs, and you're bringing up literally the lost revenue, the cost of the cost and the cost of losing employees, but then the benefit of employee retention through what you're doing here. So one more question. I'm just going to ask this because I think it's extremely important in this day and age. It's also near and dear to my heart right now, right? I've been working a lot in the mental health space and with men. And I spent 10 years in a domestic violence relationship where I was the victim of domestic violence, of a partner that had borderline personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder. Now, in my research, there's a lot of people out there that might not necessarily have the disorder, but there's a lot of narcissistic tendencies out there. And I know one of your talks I saw was how to respond to a narcissist. Can you briefly share on that?
Definitely. I want to say thank you for your courage, even in unearthing that in this space. I wanted to backtrack real quick. And when it comes to even corporate consultation or doing one-on-one work with managers and teams, is actually working through the place where we go through withdrawals. And I want to speak from a neuropathic standpoint, is that the brain will then at about 4 to 8 weeks start to go through withdrawals. Even when you establish the boundaries, it only knows a certain way of living. And so when you don't continue to assert that and you don't respond to the withdrawal, you may go back. And so it's important when the body begins to go through withdrawals from the only way it knows, that you dig your heels even deeper. And that's where support comes in. To answer your question, responding to narcissists, it is really difficult because the funny thing about responding to narcissists is that they have a way of corralling other people around them to build a case against you. And so it's taking the risk of going no contact. And understanding, I did a post a long time ago. It's called The Narcissist Within. Each of us has narcissistic tendencies. If we're willing to admit it, that need to be needed. And when you actually go in and deal with the narcissist within, like, what does it feed in me to continue to hold space with said person? And my response to them, they've only been able to be an energy vampire because I give them what they want. What does it feed in me to continue to give in this way that is draining? And then addressing the root cause of the belief system that is upholding that. I've coined a phrase: a pattern remains a pattern until it's disrupted. And so actually going in and doing the hard work of disrupting that continual pattern and cycle that feels normal, but is literally draining you physically, socially, emotionally, and financially. And so taking the risk of going non-contact, and then when you go through those withdrawals, actually addressing them, because that need will come up in your brain and your mind. It's like, oh, I need to be in this space again. It's like, no, you don't. The belief tells you you have to be there because it's been coded into your brain, but that's where we unlearn. And when you're committed to unlearning and committed to relearning, that's where you get results.
Say that one more time, that last phrase, committed to learning and unlearning. Say that again.
When you're committed to unlearning and also committed to relearning, that's where you get results.
That's the mic drop phrase right there. I don't even need to ask you for one last final thing, because that's the one that really hit me and gave me chills, man. Jahmaal, it's been an honor. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for coming on. Again, everybody, this has been Insights with Ovationz. You can head over to ovationz.com and check out Jahmaal. He can come into your organization, work with you one-on-one. And I recommend, I strongly urge you and encourage you to go back and listen to this again in context of everything we just talked about. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.